in the memo from the Luke signed, but I think it's from all three of you TAs. Is that okay? So we're recording now. In the next 2 weeks on the syllabus, it has space for student presentations if there are students first. We've asked, we can send out another flyer. Actually, we got few enough here. Maybe I shouldn't even ask right now, but in order to encourage response, if anyone has an BA, MA in draft and would like to present some of it, please do contact all four of us as soon as you can, and we'll try to schedule those. But almost all of you took the exam, including the MA students. So I think we're MA PhD students. I think we're likely to have relatively few papers. So we're looking into some related options. Okay, which says one is also to defer the local ethnic specific section on the reading list to the future, but also we're folding it into the discussion of the NPC and the reactions against the NPC. Okay, so that's, in a sense, that's a complicated brief summary of a simplified summary of a complicated agenda. Okay, let's do the same thing right now. What's happening in the world around us with such themes as the European Union consolidation and fragmentation within it, the election of Biden, the challenges remaining with Trump supporters having about half the votes, the strong populist cases of the Philippines, Brazil, the dramatic fragmentation of the political systems by the parties visibly in Italy and France that I talked about, British as well. I mean, Brexit basically destroyed the traditional British left-right party classification. How can we make sense of these complicated, diverse patterns? Let me go through the simple options and then remind you again of what I said right at the beginning. There is no one simple story. There are multiple stories all going on, and they're in the streets simultaneously. But if we nevertheless can at least identify a smaller number, 4, 5, 6 simpler stories, we can explain some of the activities of some of the people in the streets, in their voting, in their non-voting, in their lifestyle challenges, and more. Okay, so what are these? Number one, clientelism, quid pro quo, quid pro quo. You give me a garbage pail or a chicken dinner for Christmas or Spring Festival, something or other in China, cash in Taiwan, and I will vote for you. In Taiwan, they even a few years ago had something like $463 was the price of a presidential vote, and you get it in an envelope in cash. And that's how dramatic it was in some places. So clientelism is still there, but what's happened in the last 20 years, clientelism has become labeled corruption in Chicago, in China, in Africa, in the European Union, etc. Okay, so it's an option. It's still probably the number one political dynamic going on in the world, but it's sub rosa or challenged. Number two, class, rich, poor, proletarian, capitalist leadership. Clearly, that's there in various forms. A little, you can frame it more strongly. It's going on more weekly. The book I did, the exchanges that we had over this issue, with the book I co-edited with Seymour Martin Lipset. summarize meetings that we had over 10 years of debates with people, especially at Oxford and Berkeley, who were challenging and arguing the persistence of class, or at least the lack of clear change in any single direction. That changed in turn with the dramatic election of Tony Blair. Tony Blair really gave most of the Brits who had said we live in a class society the sense, I mean, if the main left party had given up leftism as dramatically as Tony Blair did, that really led to the dramatic, I'd say, relative decline of the salience among the smart, very smart, young, critical, dynamic researchers in political science, sociology, and so forth. So class is still there, but it explains less. Number 3, the NPC, which we could say is building on the earlier label of reform, simple label from the 19th century onward. Reform in the sense of less ethnic specificity, less clientelism, less class, more of the commonwealth, the public good, and a combination of liberal social issues, let's say tolerant social issues, but caution about major welfare state activity. Okay, and so in terms of putting, I'll list these and then come back and give you a couple of pictures of each. The NPC, the 4th, we can call local specifics. That there's no one paradigm as simple and clear as clientelism or class or the NPC, but we've got a lot of local specifics, including reactions against each of these. So with Trump, you have a reaction against the tolerance. That is, the entree of Trump was the Mexicans are rapists. So he's attacking the general social liberalism, which most Americans still supported. But the reason he did that was the primary voters inside the Republican Party would turn out at a higher level, and he could mobilize them and beat the other Republican primary candidates. And that was the critical part, and due to the unique, quasi-unique American primary rules. The Europeans or people in other countries with elections in Europe, most of the world, don't do that because they don't have primaries. So the battle is inside the party elites, and which way the decisions go depend on those party elites nationally, but then the local party leaders, the local party activists may agree or may fight with their own elites. And that's what makes it more complicated. But we go into that in some of the more subtleties in the NPC book using the 20 countries for which we had more complete data. And as I said, there's 7 books on the NPC, and I'm mentioning The Breakdown of Class Politics as a second one. Okay, so I'm giving you the overviews. Let me just show you a picture for each of these, and then we'll get back to, so you can have something clear and simple in your mind. So we have the simple story and the complicated story. So if this is the simple NPC story, you've seen this before, so I won't go through it in detail, but keep it in your mind as a simple way of telling a story. And sorry, let me add a contextual point, which frames all of these specific processes that I'm talking about. By these specific processes, clientelism, class, NPC. What you have in this figure is 2 things. You have factors leading toward paths, leading toward the new political culture, but we also have some beginnings of framing, that is, of transforming of the whole set of rules of the game. And so these are in the far left patterns of the boxes. So we have 4 big boxes, and then smaller smaller dynamics within them. So the big long-term things are the decline of agriculture and manufacturing, the rise of high-tech information services as an occupation, income, higher income and general affluence over the long term. The whole 20th century, this is going on. From World War II to present, this is going on. Even though this is not, these are not happening in big way in each year. So the press, the media, and the popular discussion focuses on what happened yesterday, what happened in the last 6 months. But they usually play down these bigger things, which are big drivers. Slimmer social factors, the slimmer family. I mean, the big demographic issue, used to be we're eating up all the food. We have too many people. We're going to die or we're going to kill each other because we have so many people and so little geographic space. Okay, the simplest visible way to change that was the Chinese, the one-child policy. Bang, so the Chinese did that for how many years? 10 years, something like that. Then they began to say, hey, we're not going to have enough young people to support the older people. Hey, we better stop this one-child policy. Okay, the same thing is happening in different ways in Italy. Italy's the most extreme, one of the most extreme cases, but we have a variation of it in most of Western Europe, Germany, and a weaker version in the US, that there are fewer younger people. And so how can you fill the gap? Immigration. Okay, so the Germans, okay, how many of you read in the press? I didn't know this myself until recently. Which is which countries have the most immigration in the world? US is number one. And we're talking now about, this has not really been publicly presented. It's presented in fragments right now by the new Biden plan to have a whole series of immigration changes. But one summary implies that we could have 20 million immigrants legalized or here very, very soon and fast. Okay, big numbers. And obviously this is a proposal. This has not been approved by the leadership, but it shows the magnitude of potential change. Okay, the U.S. is a number one immigration country and has that culture, and it's always been an immigration country. The Europeans not, the Asians not. They have strong national cultural identities, and so to challenge, the French cultural nationalism is to say, you're un-French. This is terrible. We don't want this. So it's a bigger cultural political challenge than in the U.S. And in that way, what Wenmeo is doing her MA on Chinese nationalism. So she's our local expert. We're trying to draw her out. What are the multiple complicated ways of defining the Chinese nation? What we get in the Western press is very simplified, and she's got a much more complicated. But within China, it's very complicated too. Look at different surveys, different cases, and you get the fourth point: local specificity. We'll talk more about that for China soon. So what I'm adding to the four general points is the big background factors. And these are most simply summarized in this figure 2, factors driving toward a, whoops, do I haven't shown this to you. Okay, or have I? Yeah, no. Okay, so yeah, let me put this on the screen for you here. This is share screen. And I'll do these one at a time. Okay, so we got that new political culture. So you know this. I'm talking about it, and you've heard the big points, but I'm just reminding you the change in the occupation, rise of income, and then below social factors, big things. more education. And I mean, and across the world and within most of Western Europe, clearly this leads to more tolerance. Two big exceptions I'll flag just to show how this is not this is not a deterministic pattern. Poland and Ireland. More education, including higher education, does not lead to that much more tolerance. Germany is moderate, not as much. That is, you've had persistent historic patterns which say that the educational system does not inculcate the kind of American tolerance for everybody, which we have in, let's say, in much of the world. But it gets tricky when you get to, take look at variations like Texas, okay, or people, okay. Contrast Texas A&M with Austin. If you know anything about Texas, we can come back there. That is in Austin. When I was on the campus giving talks, you have guys going to their ROTC wearing knee-high black riding boots with a proud, arrogant style of the European aristocratic elite. Okay, so that's a cultural model which you don't see so much, but it's there. Okay, you have the same thing in Korea with required military. It looks like look at the photographs of Chiang Kai-shek just about to give up and leave for Taiwan. He and his staff are dressed beautifully. They look like aristocrats with Chinese black horse riding boots. Okay, but they lost. All right. Don't forget the black riding boots. You learned it in this course. Okay, so the NPC picture is one simple summary. The next one I want to flag here, I'll just close the screen share and reopen it, and go now to instead this one, which sorry, let me introduce. Yeah, no, this is look. I'll go to, or I'll show it with. To use, and we'll use Chicago to illustrate this. And here we are. Share screen. If we look at the Chicago leadership from Daley 1 to present, the simple story of the book, called Trees and Real Violins, a Chicago case study. We have the mayors on the left, their dates, big pattern, the rise of social and aesthetic issues compared to traditional fiscal economic issues like low taxes. The rise, the next column, the rise of independent organized groups, not just the party, but independent organized groups, environmental, etc. The empowerment of individual citizens, the rise of public goods, managed growth and consumption. So these are NPC type issues specified for Chicago and with strong examples. And the way these are more often discussed by Chicago specialists is two big themes which are stressed in the book because they so contradict the normal media and more popular discussion. One, the rise of reform, which is the social issues, aesthetics, consumption, the lakefront festivals, the hundreds of thousands of people who come here for 4 months of entertainment and who then stay on. The largest number of arts school graduates in any city in the US are here. The Art Institute, Columbia College, lots of artists, and more of them stay here than if you're in, Bloomington, Indiana. So there's an arts base, which is then supporting these kinds of trying out new neighborhoods. Wicker Park was the case study written up most by Rich Lloyd. The classic, or that is, it's changed, it's moved over as then after 10, 20 years, the artists get driven out because the rents go up so much. But that dynamic is there, and featuring the rise of social and aesthetic issues. But the two big themes here, which are in Chicago and nationally, in some ways internationally, are one, political reform, fighting corruption, quote, or fighting clientelism and labeling it corruption. And second, the rise of the arts, culture, consumption, entertainment, aesthetics. You have these in Chicago, you have them in China, you have them in Europe. And so we can choose strong versions of these to illustrate the cases. But these are ways of showing you how we can go beyond the sense of we have only noise and fragmentation by looking at the specifics, not just in one city, but going down to smaller neighborhoods within cities. Again, one more anecdote that illustrates this point here, which I'll leave on with the Chicago board just to briefly illustrate. I had a student who was a Chicago fireman, and he lived with his father and his grandfather. They're Irish Catholic, and they argue at dinner every night, whatever. And the grandfather says Chicago politics is nothing but ethnicity. The father says, no, it's the party. And the party's strength and who's in control in the party is the driver, and you can react against it, but that's the key third story. The son, the third generation, said, you both are wrong. What matters is individual citizens and neighborhoods, and they are moving in individualized, more consumption directions in ways that no longer fit with the party and no longer fit with ethnicity. So within one family, one ethnic group, which also illustrates by its refutation the degree to which social primordial factors explain your views. Same family, same ethnic group, same religion, dramatically different views of what's going on around them. Okay, so the father goes back to the Mayor Daley I tradition. Or let's say prior to Daley, this was Chicago politics through the whole late 19th and 20th century. The strong machine emerged in 1932-33, and it crystallized, especially with Daley I, 1955, when he was elected. Okay, dramatic support for him, but he stressed the common man, etc. No clear attention to most of the later social issues, casual racism, authoritarian, patriarchal governance style. Okay, that's the grandfather. The grandfather going back, the father took from that the patriarchal and the party. The son goes way down to the end, and the son is observing these kinds of things going on. So they're all, but my point is, you can find all of these today in Chicago within a single family, within a single neighborhood. Okay, then let me end that one and go back and look for the third one here, which is from Scenescapes. And this, where have I got this thing here? Here we go. Okay, does that work for everybody? See the line chart? Okay, this is the version right from the book, which is not updated to 2016. But if we add the 2016 election, the first election of Donald Trump, The same lines extend further. They just get a little bit further apart. So that, but the point is, Donald Trump was not a revolution. Donald Trump was continuing a pattern going on in the 5 previous presidential elections from 1996 onward. And what you see here is the quiet, increasing separation of social and cultural issues as captured in these six particularly salient dimensions of scenes, and that these explain dramatically more presidential voting. And that happened for two driving reasons. One, the increased educational level of the American population, and two, the self-selection of locations where they would reside, that people live. People increasingly choose the neighborhood where they have neighbors and others closer to what they want to live in terms of lifestyle, and then they tend to vote in the same way, which leads to the political maps changing within Chicago and then across the US by state. But the state level is the higher level you go for aggregation. You can find some patterns that are bigger and simple. I mean, the West is more individualistic, a little more fiscally conservative, a little more socially liberal, etc. But when you get down to the neighborhood level, within LA, within Chicago, you've got these kinds of more subtle patterns. Okay, so those are my three pictures to sort of give you the simple story. But the complicated story is that lots more is happening as well when we get down to these specifics. And I'll just mention one or two, and then we can go to a few that we talked about, or that our 3 TAs will talk to us about. Let me just mention a couple of quick examples as lead-ins, in addition to Chicago. The Ford regime is the term used by Dan Silver and his co-author for Mayor Ford of Toronto, and then his brother, who is the governor of the largest province in Canada, Ontario, which is the region of Toronto. They both have in a sense, they're a little bit like Trump, in the sense of being socially conservative on some things. That is, they campaigned against bicycles and artists, or cyclists and artists. We want cars. We want suburban style. However, the political base is not traditional Canadian. It's immigrant. These are newer immigrants, new but successful immigrants to Canada who are voting for him, basically. So they're people who've succeeded economically, but they don't want this bohemian bobo lifestyle illustrated by a Bill Clinton playing his musical instruments, and the Hollywood, the Manhattan lifestyle. That is what they don't want. And so you have that combined with Mayor Ford overindulging in drugs, collapsing, taken to the hospital, nearly dead with drug overdoses. At the same time, so he's engaging in some of the bohemian lifestyle excesses, but he's denying it publicly. Okay, so both local specific. So then the next. So and he was elected as mayor of Toronto when the previous mayor was strongly in favor of lifestyle tolerance for bicycles, for artists, for that is enough so that it challenged the folks who did not want that. It was analogous to the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump election loosely, with the big exception that Ford was the opposite from Trump on immigration. So what that illustrates, I would say, here is the fragment. These individual lines are national, and so if you get down to the neighborhood and to the city, these can reverse and become more complicated. It doesn't say we can't understand them. It says, let's get some sharp, clear models. Then let's try to say, how and why do they work? Using, for example, our Chicago fireman family. I mean, each of those three interpretations are clear, explicit, and you can say there's a rationale and a causal model as to why they should be different, growing up in different time periods and the factors which are not unique to this family. Okay. And then I'll just mention a paper by Dan Della Posta, who was a student here, and he's now I've forgotten what university he's at. I won't try to bring it up, but basically he's done some papers extending what we've got here, and he's analyzed the French data. And he shows, I mean, the finding, one of the key participants at Oxford in the debate with us over class politics has a new story. It's not class, it's immigration. So the simple story is the more immigrants you have, the more anti-immigrant voting you have. And that's a simple interpretation of Brexit in the British case. And many of the European, there have been many papers that say the more immigrants to France in a city, the more you have anti-immigrant votes. So there's several cities, especially in southern France, where the National Front has the majority in the city council, and the mayor is a National Front party member. And so that holds as a national relationship. If you look, let's say, explaining an adjusted R-square, maybe 15%. I mean, that is, these relations are all relatively modest and sometimes weak, but they can get stronger in one city okay. What Dan Della Posta has done is to reanalyze this and say, if you have now, it's a new way of statistically analyzing multiple levels simultaneously. Multi-level analysis, mixed methods are different names for this. HLM, very hot these days in the journals. And basically what he shows is that if you analyze France and French voting at the department level, a medium low level unit, let's say roughly like a SMSA in the US metro area, then that holds. The more immigrants to the department, the more anti-immigrant National Front voting. But if you go to the commune level, the individual, we can call it a city, but in Paris, there's 17 of these within the downtown city, either 17 or 23. This is smaller than the entire city of Paris. So if we go down to the commune of the arrondissement for the biggest French cities, it reverses. The more immigrants you have, the more immigrants, the less the National Front voting. So that's in part because you have immigrant neighborhoods, such as in areas where you have a majority of immigrants, and they can then vote for their own candidates. But you then have you also have tolerant, that is, the majority of the French population is still tolerant, even if in different contexts, depending, or another dramatic way was in a paper by Dan Della Posta and me and Steve Sawyer, published in the, which book was it? Is it the, sorry, I can't remember which book this is in, but basically, if you look at the French voters in two kinds of elections, they're local elections for mayor, and they're European Union elections for a party that will be represented for that town in France in the European Union Parliament. You get opposite results. that you get more class voting, that is the rich versus the poor people, the higher income, higher education people in the cities vote for the conservative parties. The lower status people vote for the communists and socialists. But in the European Union elections, it reverses. And everybody tends to, that is, you tend to get even lower status, but more people voting for things like lifestyle issues, more environmental issues, more women's issues. So those NPC social issues are dominant, and they in turn via the EU rules are transforming local elections in France. Most dramatic case was, I briefly mentioned last time, Edith Cresson. That is the communists and the National Front were strongly anti-immigrant locally, very locally, at the same time that their parties were not. Edith Cresson, the socialist, saying, my God, we're losing out to the communists and the National Front. What are we going to do? So she became more anti-immigrant than the others. And then after she left the prime ministry, she became the top administrative official in the European Union. And I gave you the story. She gave a large grant to her dentist and then was famously attacked. And she said, if you can't work with your own dentist and the people you know, who can you work with in life? Okay, so she was articulating clientelism is legitimate, localism and ethnicity are legitimate. And what happened to her? She was fired by the majority, which was more Northern European, German, Scandinavian, etc. They said, we will not legitimate this kind of daily Edith Cresson traditional clientelism. It is now corruption. And so it's still there. You can still find this if you look at the right level, but it's publicly, the national Chinese government is very strict. They hang people for doing this kind of thing in China by the national government. At the local level, they do it all the time. There's still all kinds of clientelism, just as there is in Chicago. Okay, so that's my quick overview. I've given you the simple story, and I'm showing you the more complicated variations. Let me close this down. Nationally and internationally, using distinctively extreme cases to illustrate the broader patterns, because that's a way to sort of fix them in your mind without giving you the fancy statistical ways of doing the same kinds of things. But these are all going on. All right, let's have maybe a little general discussion of anything I may have said specifically, but then we've gotten to some very interesting ways that we've discussed to elaborate this using your own exams and your own discussions next. So questions or comments on what I've said? Anything for clarification, at least, and whatever else. Max.
So you mentioned the way that neighborhood dynamics have been changing over, in that 20-ish year period. How does gentrification affect neighborhood alignments with, these classifications as far as being, expressive or neighborly, and how do patterns of gentrification affect political alignments?
Yeah, let me use my own Bronzeville. There's a big literature on this, two quick points. One is what is gentrification? One measure is to say it's an increase in income of previously lower income neighborhoods. Pure income definition. And that becomes controversial because some of that may be local people who are raising their incomes. They may be getting better jobs or whatever. It also may be new people migrating in who are higher in income. But it's a change which you can see, such as having art galleries in Bridgeport, for instance, traditional blue-collar Chicago politics neighborhood. And Manhattan is filled with examples of this. But so my first point is that income is not culture and lifestyle. And that even if incomes are going up, second, even if new people are migrating in, and even if some of the new people are higher in income and higher in education, that does not necessarily mean that they do change the lifestyle. And this is dramatically illustrated by the woman who did her PhD at Northwestern, whose name I'm blocking on, but she studied a town in Maine and the Swedish neighborhood just nearby Wicker Park and just north of there, up close to Uptown. Basically, the dramatic story is there were a number, especially of women living together and who did not want to try to drive out the Swedish maypole dance lifestyle. And so she goes into detail. She has another paper on 4 different types of lesbians in 4 different cities across the US with 4 different cultures. So the point of her point, which is that new people don't necessarily want to change. They may have migrated to Wicker Park or to a neighborhood because they love that and they appreciate that cultural distinctiveness. And so they learn, even if they're not Swedish ethnically, they learn to do the Swedish cultural artistic activities. So even if you're not Chinese, you might be able to learn to dance with the Spring Festival dragons in China. And at least in Chinatown, you might be able to pass. If you keep a dragon over your head, nobody sees that your face is white instead of Chinese. And so maybe you could even participate in the Chinese Spring Festival if you had a Caucasian face. That's what she shows, basically. That gentrification economically need not imply, or let's say rise in income need not imply gentrification. If you define gentrification as driving out the poor, so if the crude version is driving out poor and let's say minority residents, then the question is who's doing this? So Theaster Gates is a case I've cited of he's not driving anybody out at all. He's trying to help people who live there do a little bit better themselves. Fix up your own house, make it more attractive, get a better job. I mean, do things with more subtlety, and you can improve your income, and you can also improve your commitment to and your subtlety appreciation of Black culture through Black films, through Black dance, through Black music. He's doing that. So point example 1. Example 2, Bronzeville, where I live, where this is, so we have, it was the fastest increasing neighborhood in terms of rent and some measures of income in the early 21st century. But it's still 99% Black. Who are these people? I've talked to them. You can have social workers, artists, teachers, real estate brokers who are African American living in a Chicago suburb or living on the north side and who say, Bronzeville is a culturally attractive place. I want to come back where my roots are and I feel at home. I feel more at home here than I do in Lincoln Park or in Winnetka. So you have a social cultural driver. They want the cultural authenticity of Bronzeville. And yes, they're bringing higher income. They may drive out some lower income, or they may raise the prices of the lower income residents who are here. Is that gentrification? That gets more ambivalent. And so the term is generally not used locally within Bronzeville or by people. So in that sense, sometimes race can trump income. So I'm saying if we look at each of these, and then if we go not just to race, but to say to lesbians, lifestyle, sexual lifestyle, each of these has different meanings. So what I'm using this case to illustrate the same points that I've just made. It doesn't fit with tradition. I mean, that is, how much does this fit with clientelism, class, the rise of the NPC, or local specificity? And there's some of all of those still going on in each of these neighborhoods. Okay, well, that's my overview answer in trying to join your specific question, which is classically there. Everybody talks about it. And I'm trying to say, you, based on this course and what I'm just saying now, can say, well, there are 4 or 5 ways of answering it. And they're all partially right. That's what's complicated. Okay. Any other questions now? Okay. Let's push on, because we got an agenda which Michael and Wenmio, how do we want to proceed with the other themes which you had from the student exams? Or Luke, yeah, the 3 of you, how do you want to handle this?
So I may first go over the SAA, the topic about COVID-19, and then I will basically talk about Carrie Wu's article on the COVID.
Great, please do.
So, more than half of the students, they chose SAA as their they talk about COVID-19, and then most of them will use theories from assessing a global city. And also I'm impressed by some of them. They include the agent rating about low end globalization. They try to use this article to explain what globalization is. And I'm also impressed by one of the students. She he or she commented on the WHO general director general's tweet that that China is actually setting a new standard for outbreak response. So it is argued by the student that such a new standard response is not actually fair for all countries to follow, because not every country in the world, they can follow the strict shutdown policy as what China did for Wuhan and also the majority cities in China. So overall, I think SAA is relatively easy. So I appreciate all of your essays. So all of you did a good job. And then I will go to Carrie Wu's paper on who stays physically active during COVID-19. It's basically about inequality and exercise patterns in the United States, which is quite interesting, especially because this is closely related to our daily activities. So basically, this article deals with how existing social inequalities may create unequal physical exercise patterns in the United States, especially during the pandemic period. So I will give you some brief introduction here. It basically says that since COVID-19, so people are more aware of our physical health and also as well as our mental health. So last year, the World Health Organization, they has one initiative called the healthy at home, so which encourage everyone to remain physically active, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic period, and also to take care of your mental health. But as we all know, because of this pandemic has like disrupt all our like normal exercise routines, like because the first example is that we have the like self like kind of like social distancing like practice, and meanwhile we do have like Zoom schools, like Zoom universities, working from home, this kind of like new like normal like routines for our daily life. So all these physical exercise routines are like heavily disrupted because of pandemic. So and days like according to Carrie Wu has like even like worsened the pre-existing inequality in exercise in the United States. I will give you some like details. Say it says that like a survey like tells us that women are usually less physically active than men across the globe, like across age groups in the United States, because of like women's gender role and also their family responsibilities, particularly. And also Blacks are less active because they often live in less safe neighborhoods and have more functional like health problems. And also individuals of lower socioeconomic status, they are less physically active than their counterparts. So these unequal physical activity patterns can be particularly prominent in the time of crisis. Carrie Wu has made some like data visualizations to help us see how the pandemic can worsen the like existing inequality in physical exercise. But what is surprisingly is that like the pandemic has led to a substantial increase in physical exercise, which means people are more willing to doing physical exercise during the pandemic period, like compared to surveys in 2019. And also Americans are physically more active during months with warm weathers. So Carrie Wu like used data visualization to show that the pandemic has like indeed like make the inequality in physical exercise like worse than before. So it said that although all Americans have become physically more active since the outbreak, however, the pandemic also like worsened the pre-existing quality, and their additional analysis shows that individuals who exercise more frequently during the pandemic report more favorable mental health. So, but I found his like policy recommendation very interesting. He finally said that policy interventions addressing the widened inequality in physical activities can help minimize the like inequality in equal like mental health impact of the pandemic on the disadvantaged populations, which I said like female or like a Black American, and also like people who are from disadvantaged like backgrounds. So maybe maybe we can have some discussions on this article, especially like we're all familiar with COVID. Do you all agree with what Carrie Wu mentioned, like in the article, that Americans today are more actively engaged in like physical exercise? Or do you think are there a contradiction between active physical participation and the spread of the virus? Because as we can see from the the information we provided in the like midterm, that many Chinese cities are shut down like because of COVID. And like just share some like story like of the city I come from. Like each household actually they are assigned with a limited number of tickets, which means that if my mom want to go out and do some shopping, then my dad cannot go out. So like this is quite common for most Chinese cities, but which also like make people less active in physical activity, like in public parks say. So do you think like increasingly active physical exercise can do good to to contain the spread of COVID-19 or vice versa? So this is all my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you. Any comments, reactions, questions? Max and Max has been talking. Adam, you haven't been talking, so why don't you speak up first? Adam Rusikow.
Yeah. Hi. Well, I guess like I may not have caught it, but I think like there's a lot of variation between the beginning of the pandemic when like a lot of people were laid off and furloughed, and now like so I think that would account for a lot of the variation. But I think like now, I mean, obviously this is anecdotal, but I know like me and all my friends like take way less steps per day, and like, but like now that gyms are like reversing their closures, like you're starting to get, I guess, more people exercising. But again, like I think it just depends a lot on like when we look back in hindsight with all the data, I think overall there's probably going to be a decrease in exercise just because of like closures. And then I guess in regards to the question of like whether it decreases the spread, I guess, I mean, I guess it wouldn't necessarily decrease the spread, but I guess people will be like less, the mortality rates are lower in communities where there's more exercise, but I don't know, like it's hard to isolate because that's also compounded by like, as she pointed out, wealth levels. So,
Mylan?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and my answer kind of aligns more with Adam. I think you just spoke in regards to the COVID and the exercise levels. I think a lot of people are exercising, but when you look at the gyms and such, many of them don't have their mask on. They'll take them off once they get into the gym, and they become COVID hotspots now for public parks and areas where you can go walking with individual who you're staying with. I think that's a different story. But when you look at the amount of time you're spent exercising, it's more directly attributable to the amount of wealth in neighborhoods, the amount of access to affordable and adequate health care, and that you see decrease in mortality for COVID-19.
Andrew, I mean, we're not going to get a definitive yes or no on any of these. So getting a couple of perspectives is great. So Andrew, you haven't spoken. Go ahead.
I do think it's also interesting the degree of state breakdown, even when all other factors are the same. So just as was discussed with restrictions on leaving the house in China, I think it could be compared to the workout routines of, say, California versus Florida. In Miami and LA, you have very similar climates, very similar income distributions and demographics, but radically different experiences with access to gym or even using outdoor recreation facilities, in large part because of local restrictions.
Good points. Adding specific, small but distinctive variables. Yeah, Max, briefly.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting changes I've seen here in Chicago is I feel like for me especially, and I think a lot of people, pickup basketball was a huge source of exercise, and the city took down most of the outdoor basketball hoops, which prevented people from, as Andrew was saying, that's a significant source of exercise, being able to go to the park. I wonder how the inavailability of certain means of exercise, but also the communal and cultural effects of certain exercise practices, like playing pickup basketball with people you don't know, developing bonds and relationships and dynamics around that. I know here on UChicago's campus, I've made a lot of connections just through pickup basketball. The more isolated forms of exercise that people have had to adapt to have likely changed community practices and relationships throughout the pandemic.
Okay. Every one of you are right. You've all made good points, and that's why this is complicated. It's not as if this is a black, white, yes, no kind of thing, but And we have a mayor who's trying to act a little more forcefully, such as closing all the Chicago parks in a serious way, but then not implementing it, or implementing it partially in different neighborhoods, different days of the week, different hours of the day. So I'll just say I've been out every other night through this entire pandemic, bicycling, usually 2 hours a night, every other night, but often after midnight, right through the middle of the city. And then I go to the north side, I go around Hyde Park, I go everywhere. And you see all the things all these things you're describing, but I'm in better shape now than I was before the pandemic. Okay. But I've never been to a health club. Okay, so let's push on. We've got another big issue question, which Michael, are you going to lead on?
Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah. So I wrote the question essay B for GameStop. I'm gonna assume most of you know most about it, but the gist of it is there's a stock that that the Wall Street big firms are shorting. So they're betting that the price of that specific stock will go down, and the ordinary individual traders don't think this is a good thing, so they're buying more and more of the stocks, pushing it to go up. So most of you mentioned that this is a David versus Goliath kind of movement between individual traders and big banks. So I think this is more of a discussion, kind of 10-minute discussion between all of you who have done some research in the problem and know from your background. So I want to pose it as a question first. So I guess the first one is, why do you think this happened? Some of you mentioned McAdams, some of you mentioned the flattening of the globe. Some of you also mentioned the trust issue. So I would just want you to, based on your essay response and what you've learned, I will just start a conversation at the moment. So why do you think this happened?
Challenge.
Well, actually, I know a lot of your names, so I know who wrote this question or not. So. Yes, Ram.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting question. I guess what I would point out is that the Reddit user who kind of started the whole movement and like did all the calculations and suggested that GameStop was being undervalued, he kind of did an interview after this whole thing blew up and suggested that he wasn't trying to make it a David versus Goliath battle, and that he was just kind of trying to show, like, with calculations and with theory that the GameStop was being undervalued, and that this subreddit was the perfect platform that he could use to kind of like put his theories out into the world. So I guess that just kind of shows that that would support the idea that this wasn't a movement necessarily to kind of like go after the big banks initially, at least. It was something that people that kind of just happened because there was a chance for it to happen. Like, this guy just kind of put out his ideas into the world, and then it kind of picked up movement perhaps through this framing of David versus Goliath. But originally, perhaps that wasn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, that's great. There's this sense that this wasn't intentional in some way, but rather there's a lot of things, in history that came together, that all the stars were aligned, and this happened, this burst it out. So anyone else on this question? I think I saw something on the chat. Yes, Max.
Yeah, I think to Ron's point, it's interesting that like the guy who started out obviously didn't have this intention, but I think the combination of the opportunity structure, right, the ability for Reddit to instantly connect people, and the like democratization of investing tools like Robinhood allowed a lot of people to get together and come on board and join together around this message. And then the framing that Ron pointed to, in addition to the like ability to center it as a David versus Goliath message, the already like existing linguistic practices in Reddit groups that allow for them to create a sense of community was already there. There's all this like memes that developed around it, these formats that people were able to use to, inspire a sense of community and to frame it as a battle they were fighting together. That made it easier to mobilize and create a sense of collective action around this process. So these factors that were already in place, these framing and opportunity structures that were already in place, kind of came together with this opportunity that, as Ron pointed out, was not initially meant to be political, but I think it was the combination of we have an opportunity here plus the structures and framing in place to make it into a movement kind of combined.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So regarding the political opportunities, one of the answers that I read that's pretty interesting is it's a new administration, and the new administration is dealing with a lot of stuff, so it doesn't really have the time to deal with this stuff. And secondly, the specific person argued that Joe Biden is a middle-class man. He was elected. He argued he was elected on this platform, so he is rooting for the individual traders in some sense. So I guess to follow this train of thought, what would you think would happen if this happened during Trump's administration? I think that would be an interesting question to think about. I guess I don't have a lot of time. The last question I have is, do you think this is a successful movement? So when I wrote this, I wanted to connect this to the Occupy Wall Street movement a few years ago, because many people don't think Occupy Wall Street movement was a successful movement. However, for this exam, most of the responses that answered this question think this is a successful movement. So I wanted to pick your brains on this. Why do you think it's a successful movement connecting to Occupy Wall Street?
Great question for everybody to ponder.
Yes, right.
I think my answer to this would go back to Luke's presentation a few weeks back about how with Black Lives Matter, the goal might not necessarily be to abolish police, but would be to spread awareness about perhaps living in a state where the police structure looks different. And I feel like under that context, you might be able to look at this movement similarly, that maybe the goal might not be to like destroy big banks, but may be to show that retail investors do actually have some sort of power in the system. They can actually screw over the big banks if they really wanted to. And I feel like the fallout of this was ultimately a bunch of people joining into the subreddit community. Like it ballooned from a few million to now nearly 10 million. So I feel like the fact that more people are interested in investing and doing small time investing is in and of itself to show that the movement was successful.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Anyone else want to join in? I think I'll have time for one more answer, and now I'll pass on to Luke. Yes, Max.
I also think it's interesting to consider how like buzz can be applied to like social media groups and online communities, and clearly a substantial amount of buzz was generated by this, event, such that like millions of people flooded the subreddit, millions of people kind of like were drawn to it. So any future movement activity has a wellspring of support around it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I guess that's time for me. I think it's a great topic for this class, and I look forward to seeing if there would actually be any policy changes in any of the levels for this problem.
Now, Luke, do you have something you wanted to bring in now? You here?
Yeah, I'm here. We could talk about the Theaster prompt, or like in that, I sent you the email last night, Professor Clark, about the case in Bronzeville regarding the beach project. I thought that could be something interesting that would draw in the conversation about how urban planning or the built environment fits into conversations around the shift from clientelism towards entrepreneurial politics. But so I think either of those options, maybe what do you think, Professor?
Yeah, what if we defer the Bronzeville as that we can go on in the next 2 weeks, depending on time. If you want to, and we also have interest in two of you exploring further Theaster. But if you Luke, want to lead into any of these, especially maybe did you want to? Did you or the others want to start some discussion of Theaster based on this, on what you just said?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Okay. So Theaster was a third prompt. That one was the one that the least people picked. So maybe that provides some grounds for fertile conversation. But as the excerpt said, Theaster Gates is a multidisciplinary artist who does not only physical work, but he aims to create spaces that engage not only the people who are actually in the museum exhibit, but just engages the surrounding neighborhoods or communities more generally. So the question was, like, what is Theaster trying to build? Not in terms of the artistic spaces themselves, but in terms of the relationships in the neighborhood. And how does that relate to some of the class literature? And then subsequently, there's another potential question insofar as Theaster's received like some criticism and since a lot of his projects have gotten off the ground, criticism that he doesn't he's not attentive and doesn't treat his employees well, that he is kind of, there's just been kind of a litany of criticism, and then criticisms too in regards to his project as how it relates to conversations around gentrification. So that's another angle that one could take. But I guess all this is to say, what do we make of Theaster's project? How does it align not only with the readings before the midterm, but as well as readings around new political culture, which, political regimes emphasize sort of an entrepreneurial approach to the built environment. The built environment is an opportunity to draw investment, draw tourism, draw public-private partnerships. So what do we make of Theaster's project or interventions into the built environment more generally in relation to new political cultures? Does anyone have any thoughts? No thoughts?
Does anyone see any counterparts or other people who you may know in another city or another neighborhood doing similar things? But yeah, Andrew's got a hand up.
Well, this was more directly some of what you mentioned about Gates, including the point of treatment of employees. But it does seem like there's an interesting disconnect between how the spaces have been designed and then how they've been received and the changes that had to be made. Like I know in the case of the Stony Island Arts Bank, they had to close for a little while and kind of retool the mission, change up some of the designs with the currency exchange on Garfield. they had to change the restaurant space. I don't think it's even reopened. So, visiting the spaces, they seem to meet that very kind of gentrified design that you mentioned. And I do think it hasn't had quite the embrace from the community that some may expect.
Yeah, but it's pretty hard to separate that from COVID right now. So, but for sure, there's these are all factors which fold in. Anyone else? Or any further thoughts from you, Andrew? That is, if we look at things, I mean, the Arts Bank used to have, say, a yoga class. If you'd have 15 people sitting around close to each other, that's not healthy, and so forth. Or people sitting in the black film. Most of the movie houses have closed down or substantially closed down in the whole U.S., not just the Astors. So. We have a video maybe on a supplementary site, whatever, but it was the fourth MA thesis was by Yasmin Arakan, the fourth MA dealing with Theaster. That is, one was sort of ethnographic characterization of the yoga, what people did and all these activities. The second was his program of 9 principles of equitable redevelopment and how each of those had a distinctive contribution to be made, going beyond, it's in the same spirit as our whole discussion, going beyond any simple interpretation. The national quantitative study was by Yasmin Arakan, where she looked for the number of artists in different, and the presence of artists in neighborhoods across zip codes across, I'm using zip codes as a measure of neighborhood, across 45,000 zip codes in the US, ranked by income and ranked by African American and Hispanic background in terms of disadvantage, if you will. That is to test the hypothesis that only yuppies want the arts and that only the more affluent will respond positively. And that it basically refutes that in the sense that it, at every level of income and ethnic minority, there was a positive impact or positive relationship between more arts activity and higher income. So in that sense, as Theaster and some others have put it in our Bronzeville area, we don't want people in Bronzeville or around Theaster, even if they're the poorest, to feel that they must always be poor. So no, they don't want other people from outside who have a different white face to take away what they have. But on the other hand, all these things are put differently. In Bronzeville, that's not happening. That is, I've been here for decades. I've always been here, but there are very few white faces in Bronzeville. So there is not a racial transition going on at all. It might happen in the future, but it hasn't happened thus far. In that aspect of gentrification. So multidimensional. I think our conversation from the beginning to the very end today has nicely illustrated many of the same points, from what do people do and how does exercise shift with COVID, that as Huen Mio introduced, and then how does this actually work out in Bronzeville or in Theaster's sites where people are not there. And is it because they're against the ESTR, or it's because they don't want to wear masks, or they don't want to have exposure with or without a mask? For each person, each of these is partially correct for sure. And that's why these things are complicated. So we've given you both simple, clear answers, as well as more complicated, multi-causal, multi-dimensional answers. And that's life. Okay, let's end for today. We'll continue Monday. Thanks for your lively participation. And as you've heard already, your excellent performance on the exam. So those will be coming back before long, but they've been entertaining, at least the people reading them. So cheers to all. Stay on for office hours a bit now if anyone has something.